This is considered one of the most shocking cases in Polish history. On January 6, 1999, a sailor in Poland noticed something strange floating on the river. It was long and pale and it smelled very bad. And as he leaned in closer to get a better look, he saw an ear attached to it. Now, what I'm about to say next is very disturbing, so be warned. After the sailor found this substance, DNA testing then indicated it was the skin of a missing woman named Katarzyna Zawada. And whoever did this to her turned her skin into a suit and was likely wearing it. So at this point, only her skin was found. Until January 14th, when pieces of her clothing and one leg was found also in the river. 17 years later, 52-year-old Robert J. was arrested for this. He previously worked in a dissection lab, meaning he was skilled in preparing animal skin. And he allegedly also knew the victim. As of October 2022, 23 years since the victim was found, Robert J. is still awaiting trial. As he remains in custody, investigators are allegedly gathering more evidence to solve the case. Follow for more.
In 2015, a woman was sitting in her living room when she heard gunshots from nearby. Shocked, she peeked through her window, but saw nothing unusual outside. Realizing the sound might have come from her neighbor's home, she decided to check on them. When no one answered the door, her worry deepened and she called the police. Soon after, officers arrived and were forced to break down the door. Inside, they were met with a tragic scene, an older couple lying lifeless on the floor. However, by some miracle, the officers noted faint breathing coming from the woman. She was rushed to the hospital, where she later survived and was questioned about what had happened. When investigators spoke to her, the woman claimed she couldn't remember anything from that night. Initially, the police believed a third party was involved and continued their investigation. A few days later, the couple's parrot, which had been sent to an animal rescue shelter, began mimicking an unsettling phrase, "Don't shoot!" The employees, finding this behavior strange, reported it to the investigators. This revelation shifted the focus back to the surviving woman. Ballistic analysis later confirmed that the shots fired came from within the home, and all evidence pointed to her as the shooter. Glenna Durham was eventually found guilty of murdering her husband and attempting to take her own life. In 2017, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
In 2021, a single mother woke at 3 a.m. to find a masked man standing silently in her bedroom doorway. For a few tense seconds, he just stared before suddenly rushing at her. He jumped on top of her, launching a vicious attack. Despite her desperate attempts to fight him off, she couldn't overpower him and began screaming for help. In a gruff, Batman-like voice, the intruder snarled, "You're going to regret this!" After assaulting her, he demanded to know where she kept her valuables. He rummaged through her closet, grabbed what he could, and then ordered her to get up and walk outside. As they moved, he covered her head with a pillowcase. In the backyard, he forced her to kneel and issued a chilling warning. "Don't move until you hear 2 car honks or I'll end you." Then he left, paralyzed with fear. The mother stayed still until a familiar voice broke the silence. It was her ex-husband. Overwhelmed with relief, she told him what had happened, and they immediately called the police. When the police arrived, they had no idea who this intruder was, but after further investigation, the police found out that it was the ex-husband himself. He set this attack up to try to win the woman's love back.
This is a true reincarnation story. In 1992, Alex, a pianist from London, inherited an old manor in the Scottish Highlands. Locals warned him it was cursed by the spirit of Thomas Greaves, a composer who vanished in the 1800s. Alex dismissed the warnings until he found a fragment of a symphony in the attic, the notes hauntingly familiar. That night, Alex dreamt of himself as Thomas, composing with an ethereal violinist whispering, "You'll finish it for me." He woke with trembling hands and the melody stuck in his mind. Each time he played the fragment, the music seemed to expand, as if the house itself were completing the piece. Strange events followed. Candles lit themselves. The violinist's shadow flickered in the corners, and the melody grew darker. Over days, the house grew. Strange music echoed through empty halls, and shadows seemed to watch him. When Alex tried to destroy the sheet, the manor shook violently, and he disappeared. Locals now say his spirit haunts the piano, waiting for someone to finish the symphony. Those who dare visit the manor hear faint whispers. "Play it for me."
Don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments. Follow my account for more amazing content. sometimes true for stranger non-fiction. The case of Richard Trenton Chase is a story which even the most depraved horror writer would struggle to create. Over the course of 4 weeks spanning across 1977 and 1978, Richard Chase took the lives of 6 innocent victims in Sacramento, California. His murders gradually progressed in violence, beginning with drive-by shootings and culminating in acts of cannibalism.
I was doing my nightly research on very disturbing things and I came across this story. 9 hikers were found dead in Russian mountains in 1959, but honestly the way they died makes absolutely no sense at all. So their tent was ripped from the inside out as if they were running away from something, and it says that 6 of them died from hypothermia while 3 of them were killed by physical trauma. In the really disturbing part, it says that 2 of the bodies had missing eyes and 1 had a missing tongue, and the clothes they found were radioactive. Like, what in the world do you think happened? Investigation concluded compelling natural force. Like, what does that mean?
I can guarantee you that nothing will make you lose more sleep than when you look into how many people go missing after crashing their car, how they seemingly vanish into thin air, sometimes within just minutes. That's what happened to Jason Landry, and his story never fails to keep me up at night. Jason Landry was a 21-year-old student at Texas State University when he mysteriously disappeared on December 13th, 2020. What's scary to me is the fact that almost all of his movements that night were traced from his phone records, but he somehow vanished within 67 minutes in an area that he wasn't supposed to be in. That night, Jason left his apartment in San Marcos, Texas to go back home for Christmas. He left his apartment at 10:55 p.m. and his plan was to drive to his hometown of Missouri City, Texas, where all of his family members were waiting for him for the holidays. It should have only been about a 2.5-hour drive, but Jason never showed up, and what happened after this has never been explained. Instead, his dad was woken up at 2 in the morning by a phone call, and on the other end was a highway patrol officer who told him that his son's car was just found wrecked and abandoned along a gravel road in Luling, Texas. This immediately stood out as odd to Jason's dad because Luling was in the complete opposite direction from where he was supposed to be heading. A volunteer firefighter had reportedly found Jason's car 31 minutes after midnight, so not long after he left his apartment that night. It was abandoned near the 2700 block of Salt Flat Road, and just from looking at the pictures, it seems pretty desolate, and it's definitely pretty far off from the highway where he was supposed to be. It looked as if Jason had been in a single car crash, and from what authorities can piece together, it looked like he possibly overcorrected on the gravel road and then spun out of control, eventually hitting a few trees and a barbed wire fence. The front passenger door was locked, the keys were still in the ignition, and the headlights were on. But then the officer tells him that Jason is nowhere to be found, which is especially concerning because he had very obviously been in a car wreck in an area that he didn't know. So his dad immediately drove to the crash site and was stunned to find nobody there. Not a single police officer was looking for his son, but his dad walked into an incredibly eerie scene. About 900 feet from where his wrecked car was found were Jason's clothes, strewn across the desolate gravel road. I'm talking about all of the clothes he was wearing at the time of the crash. So his shirt, shorts, socks, underwear, and even his shoes. Some of his clothes had small drops of blood on them, and his watch was also found on the road. What's absolutely crazy to me though is the fact that authorities didn't process the scene as a crime. So after Jason's car was found, they didn't search.
In 1995, 4 friends rented a farmhouse in the countryside. One night, one of the friends woke up to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from the wooden floorboards downstairs. At first, she thought it might be one of her friends getting up for a midnight snack, but the eerie slowness of the steps made her uneasy. She laid still, listening as the footsteps moved through the living room, paused by the kitchen, and then finally faded into silence. After a few tense moments, she convinced herself it was nothing and fell back asleep. The next morning at breakfast, she asked the group who had been walking around, only to find that none of them had gotten up during the night. This unsettling realization prompted them to search the house. In the basement, they discovered a hidden hatch beneath a dusty rug. Panicked by the discovery, they immediately ran to their cars, drove off, and called the police. After investigating, the police found that the hatch led to a tunnel connecting the farmhouse to a nearby mental asylum. It turned out that one of the asylum's patients, who had been locked up for years, had escaped and had been using the tunnel to enter the farmhouse. This patient was very familiar with the layout of the asylum, which allowed him to move unnoticed for a long time. He was later caught by the authorities after a thorough search of the surrounding areas. Following this, the tunnel was permanently demolished to prevent any further incidents.
However, coined the phrase, "You can't make this stuff up," might have known the story of real-life boogeyman, Albert Fish. A slight, elderly man with grey hair, no one suspected the kindly single father of being sadistic child murderer and cannibal.
Freddy Krueger is a name that sends chills down the spine, but did you know the inspiration behind this terrifying character? It all starts with a man named Frank Langella who lived in the 1970s. He was a child molester, a predator lurking in the shadows. His crimes were horrifying, but what makes the story even more chilling is how he evaded justice for years. He was known to stalk children in his neighborhood, creating a real-life nightmare. Parents were terrified, and the community was in a state of panic. This fear fed into the creation of the iconic horror figure we know today. Wes Craven, the mastermind behind A Nightmare on Elm Street, drew from these dark realities. Freddy's ability to invade dreams reflects the very real fears of childhood trauma. The lines between horror and reality blur, making it all the more disturbing. The legacy of Freddy Krueger serves as a haunting reminder that sometimes truth is scarier than fiction. What if the monsters we fear are based on real people? The thought alone is enough to keep anyone awake at night.
Here are 10 chilling true crime facts from Detroit, Michigan. 1. The Detroit Butcher, 1940s to 1950s. An unknown serial killer stalked Detroit's streets, dismembering victims and dumping their body parts in alleyways and the Detroit River. Police never caught the Detroit Butcher, and the case remains unsolved. 2. The murder of Rose Larner, 1993. 17-year-old Rose Larner was brutally murdered, dismembered, and burned in a bathtub by her boyfriend and his friend. The shocking crime haunted Michigan for decades. 3. The Oakland County Child Killer, 1976 to 1977. 4 children were abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered in the Detroit suburbs. Despite massive investigations and multiple suspects, the killer was never caught, making it one of Michigan's most haunting cold cases. The White Boy Rick Saga, 1880s. At just 14 years old, Richard Wershey Jr., known as White Boy Rick, became an FBI informant in Detroit's drug underworld. He was later sentenced to life in prison for cocaine possession, though many believe he was set up and betrayed by law enforcement. 5. The disappearance of DeJuan Sims, 1994. 4-year-old DeJuan Sims vanished from a Detroit mall. Years later, a man claimed to be DeJuan, but DNA tests proved otherwise, leaving his whereabouts unknown. 6. The Deadly Masquerade Ball, 1929. During a Prohibition-era masquerade ball in Detroit, a mob hit was carried out in front of dozens of guests. The murder was allegedly ordered by the Purple Gang, a ruthless Jewish-American crime syndicate. 7. The Deadliest Day in Detroit, 1973. On July 1st, 1973, an unprecedented crime wave hit Detroit, with 24 murders in a single day, one of the bloodiest days in U.S. history. Some blamed gang wars, drugs, and economic collapse. 8. The Cass Corridor Reaper, 1990s. The Cass Corridor, one of Detroit's most dangerous areas, was terrorized by an unknown serial killer who targeted sex workers and homeless individuals. Many cases remain unsolved, and some believe the killer is still out there. 9. The Murder of Jane Bashara, 2012. Jane Bashara was strangled to death, and her body was found in her car in a rough Detroit neighborhood. Investigators later discovered her husband, Bob Bashara, was a wealthy businessman with a secret BDSM lifestyle and had hired a hitman to kill her. 10. The Unsolved Vanishing of Thelma Taylor, 1980s. Teenager Thelma Taylor disappeared in Detroit with only a blood-stained car seat and eerie letters left behind. Some believe she was kidnapped by a serial killer, but her case remains a haunting mystery.
Picture this. A peaceful getaway in a cozy cabin turns into the setting for a nightmare. That's the chilling reality of the Keddy murders, one of America's most haunting unsolved crimes. In April 1981, the quiet town of Keddy, California, was rocked by a horrifying discovery in cabin 28. 4 people were brutally killed: a mother, her teenage son, his friend,
and a family friend. The scene was gruesome, leaving investigators baffled. Yet, despite evidence and a few suspects, no one has ever been brought to justice. Even more unsettling, children sleeping in another room survived the night unharmed, but the trauma of what happened in that cabin would leave scars forever. Decades later, questions still linger. Who carried out such a violent act in this peaceful town, and why? The Ketty murders remain an unsolved mystery, a chilling reminder of the secrets that can hide behind closed doors.
Hanover at the beginning of the 20th century is shaken by a series of brutal murders, where young men vanish without a trace, their remains never found, plunging the population into fear. Central to the investigation is Fritz Hamann, a seemingly harmless butcher who lured his victims into his home, killed them in a horrific manner, and dismembered their bodies with some parts sold as meat to unsuspecting customers. Eventually, the police apprehend him. The butcher shop, dimly lit and stained with the remnants of horror, serves as a haunting backdrop for Hamann's gruesome activities. A photograph reveals Fritz Hamann's unsettling smile, casting a shadow over the innocence he portrays, while concealing the horrific truths of his crime.
In 1968, a mother and her daughter were staying in a hotel when the daughter woke at 4 a.m. to someone knocking on their door. She got up and opened the door. She was met with a man and woman stating that they were detectives, so the girl let them in. At this time, the mother was also awake. The two strangers told them that the girl's boyfriend was in a fatal car crash and that he was in danger, but then out of nowhere the woman held the girl hostage, while the man knocked the mother out with some kind of cloth. The strangers left the building with the girl and brought her to their car, where they then sped off to a nearby dirt road. The strangers then ordered the girl to get in a fiberglass box under the ground, where she was buried alive for more than 3 days. At first, the strangers asked for a $500,000 ransom, but after that failed, they confessed to the whereabouts of the girl. The girl, Barbara Mackle, was rescued, and the two strangers, Gary Christ and Ruth Eiserman Shear, were sent to prison.
In the quiet town of Taunton, Massachusetts, there's a place where the past refuses to rest. This is the Taunton State Hospital. Once a sanctuary for the mentally ill, it's now a crumbling relic and home to a haunting legend. Built in the late 19th century, Taunton State Hospital was once a beacon of hope for those suffering from mental illness. But behind its grand facade lies a dark history, a history of overcrowding, neglect, and despair. They say that in the quiet hours of the night, a figure roams the halls, a ghostly patient forever searching for the care they never received. Witnesses describe the figure as a shadowy presence, their face obscured, their movements slow and deliberate. Some say it's the spirit of a patient who died here long ago, their soul unable to find peace. Those who've seen the ghostly patient say their presence is overwhelming. A cold chill fills the air, and then just as quickly as they appear, they're gone. But the most chilling tales are of those who've tried to follow the figure, people who ventured too deep into the hospital, only to vanish without a trace. Some say the hospital itself is cursed, a place where the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we think. The Cursed Hospital of Taunton State Hospital, a haunting reminder that even in a place meant for healing, the echoes of the past linger forever.
In 1987, a couple woke up to a masked man standing at the foot of their bed at roughly 4 a.m. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out 4 sets of handcuffs before demanding that they lie on their stomach and cuff their wrists and ankles. He whispered, "Be quiet and don't move or I'll hurt someone." Since he was armed, the couple had no choice but to comply. The intruder then left the master bedroom and gently woke up their 7-year-old son and 11-year-old daughter. He then calmly walked them back to their parents' bedroom. He seemed to be confidently and precisely following an exact set of steps, although at this point the family was still unaware of his motive. Once he rounded up all the family members in the master bedroom, he finally communicated his plan. He stated that this was a simple robbery and asked for clothes, money, and food, but the family had a bad feeling. After all, this seemed like a lot of work just for a simple burglary. However, the parents had no choice but to comply. The intruder taped their mouths shut and blindfolded the kids before forcing the parents into their wardrobe and barricading it shut with furniture. He then used their bedroom phone to make a call, but his conversation was largely unintelligible. He then took the daughter to a separate room and assaulted her before thoroughly bathing her. Afterward, the intruder left for the kitchen to have some of their leftovers and milk. He finally left the home through the front door at about 6 a.m., meaning that this entire ordeal lasted about 2 hours. This was only the first attack of several, and news outlets soon gave him the moniker of Mr. Cruel. Despite the creation of a task force dedicated solely to finding him, his identity remains unknown to this day.